Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the seventh session of today. We packed in a huge amount, and so thanks very much indeed for staying with us. I'm delighted now to introduce Nikki Edwards. Now, Nikki's done a couple of presentations for us before, which is absolutely great. Each one is different, and each one has a huge amount to give. Nikki, your work as an offset inspector, we've already talked about, well, we just happened to mention, but please feel free to tell us more about that, should it come in. But more importantly, we're looking at whether we should be ticking boxes for various children to give them what they perhaps need, or whatever. Over to you, you're the expert.
Thank you very much, Ian. Obviously a subject that I'm very passionate about, so I'm really excited to spend this afternoon doing this. But a little bit about us, for those of you that have just seen Brian. Brian is my therapy dog. He works in the office with me, but my name's Nikki. I've actually worked with children for 25 years. I started my career in the early years sector, then went on to teach 16 to 19-year-olds for 10 years, which I actually loved. I don't understand why people don't love teenagers, because they were just phenomenal. I then transitioned and I was an early years inspector. So I used to register and inspect childminders and nurseries, which I did for a number of years. I found it very hard to go back after the lockdown, because obviously having a therapy and coaching practice, which I've had for just 10 years this May, I found it very hard to go back knowing that we were making no provision or any allowance for mental health support. And I really felt that we needed to put that as our dominant feature of our inspection frameworks, not the outcomes of children. And obviously my little voice wasn't going to change that. So I obviously made the decision to leave. And so I actually developed Dandelion Training and Development during the lockdown. Just as initially it was just going to be about running online courses just to provide practitioners with better mental health understanding. But now we run level 4 and 5 qualifications in coaching as well. So we kind of have lots of strings to our bow. We have Dandelion, I have a step at a time, my therapy and coaching practice. And then Brian has his own collection of children's books called The Adventures of Brian, which are an emotional literacy collection for children. So we have 28 books in our collection, all exploring different thoughts and feelings that children have. But the overall target of all of this is, our motto at Dandelion is to stop ticking boxes and start changing attitudes to children's needs and mental health. And that's poignant today, because we're going to have a look at the role of diagnostic assessment, why it's actually so important in the long-term outcomes for children, and consider some of the limiting beliefs and limited opportunities that happen often because of adults' perceptions of diagnosis and what that brings. And we're going to consider why actually a diagnosis could be a protective factor for children in the longer term. So before we even start, what I would like you to do in the chat box is take a moment, think about your current views about diagnosis of mental health needs. Think about, what's your personal perception of these, and one benefit and one limitation in the comments box. So what's one benefit of having a diagnosis, one limitation of it, and pop it in the chat box for me to see just where we are at the moment. Brilliant. So we've got some already starting. So we've got benefits: access to greater support, understanding of ourselves and enabling additional support, recognition, understanding, but limitations of mindset. Benefits around targeted attention, limitations around ongoing stigma, limitations of lack of understanding in society or the perceptions of others, a benefit of knowing specific needs. I love that. As a scientist, I totally feel at ease with this. Diagnosis may change over time too, once ways of learning are adapted. Love it. You're on a pathway to receiving the correct support and intervention. Benefit professional advice, limitation, labelling. Diagnosis allows the teen to understand themselves, but they might end up putting the child in a box. Limitations, stigma. Limitations, limiting beliefs. Single diagnosis could mask others. Limitations are only based on closed mindset. So I think, it's really great to see such a wealth of different opinions. And it's such a challenge in my work. as a therapist, as a coach, I do a lot of work with my therapy hat on is social services and adoption teams. I do a lot of work with local schools and my mental health coaching. And I think, we're really seeing this divide down the middle. So I'm going to start today's session with 2 case studies. And these, very everyday things that we can see in the coaching arena and some of those different outcomes that might occur. So we've got case study 1. Lara's 15 years old. Since she was young, she has always struggled with attention and focus at school. In junior school, things were okay. While she did not always enjoy the lessons she managed, but often commented that she was different. A therapist raised about ASD and ADD, so autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit disorder, but the school did not see the traits, so no action was taken. Let me just mute it. Oh, stopped. When she joined secondary school, she survived the first year, but then things got tough. Now she's in her GCSE year and things are really hard. She's often suspended for her behaviour, has been told she needs to grow up, and she's been labelled as challenging. She's not given any additional support as the school only provide this for diagnosis, and her mental health has deteriorated significantly, and she refers to herself as useless. What were the missed opportunities? If we think about this situation with Lara, and this is a really common situation that we can see so frequently in the education system that I was seeing with my non-Ofsted hat on, but also, going in to do inspections, you would see some of these things happening and just think, why are these limitations happening? The conversations that we have with parents, what were the missed opportunities? What went wrong? And just pop them in the chat box, what you can see might have happened. Concerns dismissed. Voice of the child not taken seriously. School didn't see the traits, so no action was taken. But how come the school did not see the traits? We'll have a talk about that one in a second. Anything else that was missed? Lack of attention and focus, not questioned further, definitely. Teachers not necessarily trained to analyse traits. No whole agency team around the family approach, all disjointed. Fab. One of the greatest challenges that we can see now we are going back some time, back in around 2008, 2007, there was the concept of the team around the child that was developed. And this whole concept was that the child sits in the centre of everything that we do, and all of our professionals should hold hands around this child and all be working in collaboration. It saddens me quite a lot that we're in 2024. And now we have the team around the family, we have the team around the school, and something that I see consistently, and I do a lot of work with schools, a lot of work with head teachers, it's still not happening. As coaches, as therapists, obviously, if you're not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, then the voice can often get lost. It takes quite a lot to gain enough credentials with a school or enough ongoing impact that they start actually listening to that voice. And so we can find that actually that gets dismissed. Whereas obviously, I'm sure for all of you that are coaches here today, we get to know our children incredibly well because children come to coaching and you're the safe place and they start to share everything. Now, one of the comments that we had was, why didn't the school pick it up? And that's twofold. With girls that have autism and ADD traits, ADHD traits, they are what I call them master maskers. They are quite phenomenal at being able to blend like a chameleon into the background. When they've looked at the research around autism and attention deficit disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, what they've identified is actually boys tend to externalize their traits much more readily. So they're picked up more often by the age of 7. Whereas with girls, they're invariably not picked up by the system until they are normally, if they're not by the age of 7, until they're 14 to 17. If they get missed at 14 to 17, they often don't get picked up again until they're premenopausal. And so what we're seeing is this real gap that their traits aren't the same. And the way that we currently diagnose in the UK is still based on male traits. And so we have sort of the pro forma of these are the traits that we see, but they are all based on male gender traits. not on female traits. And so what we're often finding is that our boys are referred to as challenging, difficult, bad behavior. They're the naughty boy syndrome that we've had for many years. Whereas our girls are often our daydreamers. They will struggle to focus or they struggle to concentrate, but they will often have a subject where they thrive. So I get lots of girls, you know, I've got one, it's English, another one, it's art. They've got this one subject where they can really concentrate. So that teacher will be like, oh, no, fine concentrating in my subject. So we get this disjointed viewpoint of what's happening. Young people that I've worked in, 70% of my caseload is children who are neurodivergent. They've all known that something was different about them for a really long time. They can see amongst their friends that something's not quite the same, or they're struggling with things that others aren't. The social side of females is that they often try to blend in with their friends. So I want you to just think about fashion trends as just a great example of how women follow a trend. They see something as being fashionable, everybody does it, or a large quantity of people do it. So, you know, when we look at our adolescent society, a lot of them, you know, are really readily susceptible to things like influencers promoting certain trends because everybody wants to fit in. And our brains naturally are very sociable. So for girls, they're much more able to mask and blend into the environment, and they will mimic what their friends are doing. So the reason we start seeing these traits at 14 to 17 is because actually they can't blend as easily anymore. When children are younger, if one person likes My Little Ponies and I like My Little Ponies, I can just copy my friend and do what they're doing. As we get into our later adolescence, young people obviously start having very different conversations and they can't just copy anymore. So the gap between them and their peers can become much, much broader. If we think about the school system, primary and junior school, there's a lot more one-to-one support. Just in general, we have one teacher, generally one teaching assistant. We've got a real level of consistency that happens. So often, because teachers are just awesome, they just fill the gap without realizing what they're doing. But then I get to secondary school and I have a different teacher for every single subject, and you don't get to know your children to the same depth that you did when they're in junior school. So again, the gap just begins to broaden. So the reason that they often get missed, and it is the majority of girls will get missed, is one, they're not referred because they don't present the same. And most schools, you know, I trained as a teacher. I don't know if we have any other trained teachers in here. When I trained, there was absolutely zero on my curriculum as a teacher around neurodiversity. So I didn't even know how to identify dyslexia or autism or ADHD in my classroom. And I taught for 10 years. And so I taught up to 2014. And in that 10 years, I had absolutely no CPD training around it. So therefore, I didn't know how to pick this up. So when I then retrained, I started looking at these things. I was like, my God, I've missed all these children in my classroom. So the teachers, those that sort of said, you know, teachers just don't have the training. They really don't have the training unless the school has taken it upon themselves to embed that within their continued professional development. We just see this ongoing space. And I've had schools that I've worked with that their Senko has said to me, actually, girls just don't have ADHD. There's still this very narrow sort of viewpoint of it. We'll often see girls' traits escalate around puberty because the raise in their estrogen levels and proestrogen levels actually just exasperate the traits, much the same as when we get to perimenopausal ages. Women, obviously, the drop in proestrogen and estrogen actually then again exasperates the traits. So it's definitely something to consider of why we see these traits. But what we often hear is it's their hormones. And whilst their hormones are at play, their hormones aren't the cause of their behavior. It's just exasperating some of those traits for them. So food for thought. Our second one, Marcus is 24. He's recently completed his degree in sports science at university. He was diagnosed with ADHD when he was 7, when school noticed that he was finding education challenging. While some moments were tough and his symptoms evolved throughout his childhood and adolescence, he was able to learn to manage these constructively. He knows that he needs to exercise daily, has had coaching around emotional literacy and social skills, and has found his area of hyperfocus. In school, he was given brain breaks and a slightly reduced timetable, allowing him to regulate. At university, his diagnosis and supporting evidence meant that he was able to have a transition visit to adjust to the new environment. He has a mentor in university to meet with, and his accommodation was carefully chosen to support his needs. He has graduated with a first-class honours degree. What were the protective moments? Tell me, what was the protective moments? What contributed to Marcus having this successful outcome? Early diagnosis, definitely. Tailored tools to support his needs, timetable, accommodation, etc. Definitely. Anything else that was there to help him? Mentoring, coaching, constructive learning opportunities. Everything was put in place to make his individual needs succeed. I had a really interesting conversation with someone a couple of weeks ago who told me that a diagnosis wasn't a protective factor for children and that actually it limited things. And I will be really honest with people that 25 years ago, when I first went into the early years sector, I didn't see the point of a diagnosis. And I'm really open about that. I didn't have an understanding of it that really gave me that focus of why it was important. I meet a lot of children in my work who are with me for a really long time. I think the beauty of coaching is they come for a block of sessions and then they keep coming back. So I see them through their transitions, you know, from junior school to secondary school, their secondary school into college, college into university. And then sometimes, you know, after university, as they start navigating the world around them. And I have very much an open door policy in my office. And something that you really see when we think about outcomes, and today is all about, you know, those positive outcomes for children, developing those life skills, is when they have this protective environment around them of adults that understand. And I think there was some really interesting comments in the comment box around, at the moment, the education system is broken. And, you know, I know from my work with head teachers and deputy head teachers, they so want to make that difference, but the funding's not there, the understanding's not there, the training's not there, the curriculum has really gone perhaps in the wrong direction. And I think I had a whole new level of empathy with that at Dandelion, we've got the contract with the Department for Education to run senior mental health lead training in schools. And writing that course was really challenging because there was, again, a prescriptive curriculum, lots of box ticking, but really interestingly, very little in that actual curriculum about mental health. So there was a, like, are you aware of the types of mental health issues? But there was no real collective understanding of what mental health was and the impact that it would have. So we had, you know, our contribution to ACEs, we had our contribution to, you know, the tick boxes of mental health. But it really made me, along with the work that I do with a lot of head teachers, start to think, you know, the Marcuses of the world are so fortunate, but what we see a lot of is the Laras who have gone askew. You know, they've had a label placed on their heads and they've got lost. So I think sometimes when we have these labels, and today is all about, you know, box ticking, and do we put children in a box? Sometimes we have a lot of internal challenge with, if I put them in a box, if they've got autism or they've got ADD or ADHD, I'm limiting them. I'm going to propose today that the biggest challenge that we have is the boxes children are put in who are neurodivergent is, I'm challenging, I'm difficult, I'm disruptive, I'm hard to meet their needs, they don't want to engage, and the boxes actually disconnect them because people put them in a box of that child's really challenging and we stop pursuing the why. So if we think about, you know, that iceberg of what we can see, I'm seeing the challenging behavior, I'm seeing the fidgeting, I'm seeing the calling out, I'm seeing the children that will challenge the teacher, will identify the things that other people are doing wrong, and we just label that as challenging behavior. That child is difficult. And what we're not looking at is underneath that iceberg. What's underneath the sea is actually I've got undiagnosed attention deficit disorder. I can't concentrate because actually I'm in such a state of sort of like sensory underwhelm, I can't cope. And so for me personally, I'm like, is the box of a diagnosis the problem, or is the box actually how we're labeling children? So some things we've got in the comment box: professionals got to know him as a person with a label under which there was individual needs, not a label, perfect, like personally perfect. Adults identify needs of youths and providing support tailored to such needs. Otherwise, the disconnection happens as youths feel lost in their paths. Definitely. Unfortunately, when it comes to funding and seeking extra support, this is the language local authorities look for as part of application. 100%. Our local authorities, I'm down in West Sussex. Our local authorities, most children who go for an education healthcare plan and EHCP are waiting over a year when their timeline state on their website is 20 weeks. And everything is being put into place to almost prevent it from happening. Or people just don't even want to submit it and are being discouraged from submitting it because there's so few places in schools that can better meet those needs. Workplace is so big now. On DE and ISO education can mirror that, surely. Definitely. Okay. So does a diagnosis matter? When you think about diagnosis, there's 3 parts to it. We've got what the child actually needs, what the parent wants, and what the professional wants. And when those 3 agendas all align, obviously magical things happen. You know, when we sit in a room and the parent says, really want my child to be assessed and diagnosed, and the professionals go, this child needs to be diagnosed because then we're better understand it, and the child's sitting there going, actually, then my needs are going to be met, we can see this great stride forwards as things start to change. Now, I don't obviously know where all of you guys are from, but I know where we are down in Sussex, we're currently looking at a 2 to 3 year waiting list for diagnosis. And while some places and some schools are being very accepting of private diagnosis, some schools are very much saying no. And we've got a bit of a problem where we are in Sussex as well, that there's a couple of providers that are popping up that aren't doing a full diagnostic assessment. So they're not collecting that information from all sides of the coin. So for those that are really familiar with the process of diagnosis, what we would normally do is take the child's input through assessments and observations, the parents' input through questionnaires and those conversations, and then the professionals' input, often from the school, sometimes from other professionals that are also working with them. We've got a few providers that have popped up that are reducing the waiting lists, but what they're doing is actually omitting the professional input. So we're not seeing all sides of the coin, which is creating a new barrier, because then schools are saying, well, I'm not going to accept that private diagnosis because it's not involved us and we're not seeing the same things, which then obviously causes a new challenge for the child and getting them appropriate support. So we've got in the comment box, funding aside, adults, parents and educators can still step up with their care and support. Parent education is also crucial. Do you know, Cecilia, I totally agree with you. And I think I do a lot of parent coaching, and when you really empower a parent to know how to help, it's phenomenal. I think what a lot of parents will say to you is it's a minefield out there. I know even those of you, that found yourself here, if you go and sit online and look for a course and identify whether that course actually qualifies you to practice, gives you a really solid basis of understanding, we see a lot of things that are out there that are not providing that. And I think parents can get so much conflicting information. And a lot of parents feel a lot of shame at sharing that their child is struggling. So I get a lot of parents saying to me, I feel like people think that I'm to blame for this. And I've had a couple of settings that they've just said, well, all ADHD is caused by trauma. So therefore the parents felt that they're actually being accused of traumatizing their child. So they've stopped asking for help. And I think, educators, professionals, all adults being really well informed about the different reasons that children develop ADHD is really crucial. As well, getting rid of on my soapbox, this statement, we're all on the spectrum. Because a child who has ADHD or autism, their brain neural pathways are constructed differently to ours. And where we're using these blanket statements of we're all on the spectrum, we're actually diminishing the needs of those children who really need that support. Because we're not all on the spectrum. We might all have different needs. We might all have different backgrounds, but the challenges that are often found are very, very different. So Claire said, parent shame is huge and being told it's passed down generations. So, and I think, 80% of ADHD is hereditary. The challenge that we have is that most parents don't know that they've got it. Because we weren't talking about this in the 1970s and the 1980s, we kind of had the blue smartie brigade. I was a 1980s kid. We had the blue smarties, don't give your child blue smarties. But a lot of parents are not recognizing that they have neurodivergent needs until their child is diagnosed. And actually, when you look back, and I know I've done with a few friends and parents that I work with, and they've kind of looked back and gone, oh my God, you can see the traits and how they evolve, but everybody won't necessarily have the same traits. What we see when we think about those circles is the professional often wants to just know what their role is. I think we very often over assume that schools, professionals know what to do, to know what they should be doing. Actually, they're quite like a little bit of guidance, about how to support it, to know the ways that they should be helping, to be given strategies and to be given support. And if we did that consistently, along with obviously the appropriate training, we might find some different levels of positive outcomes. What the parent wants is to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel their child's identity is recognised, to feel supported, to be guided, to not be judged or blamed. And the child's needs, therefore, can be met in the middle. And we start considering, where does the child's identity go? And I think that, a lot of reasons that many people don't want a diagnosis is we don't want our child's identity to go missing. They're these unique, wonderful superhumans, and we can lose sight of that if we get too boxy with it. So got the chat box, could not agree more. Honestly believe many schools are becoming toxic places for children. And I know that this is not what schools want, but the demands on them and the huge pressure placed on them to tick government boxes and agendas which have little to do with children's welfare and well-being is simply overwhelming. The curriculum is so content driven. So much has been pushed down from previously higher levels of education, and its academic focus increasingly narrow as they move through the system. So more and more children are forced out over the sides because there's no place for them. And we wonder why they can't face school. As an ex-teacher, this was not something I could continue to work in. And it's that challenge, isn't it? We are placing so much emphasis on the schools doing all of it. And as I said, the curriculum for teachers actually hasn't really changed since I trained as a teacher 20 years ago. So we're not up to date with it. And I work with a lot of social workers, I work with a lot of schools. And so we're seeing this gap of, are we being given that information? I'm having a lot of success teaching neurodivergent children online. That's brilliant. I think they so want the help. My neurodivergent clients are just phenomenal. So we need to think, when we start thinking about tick boxing, how well do you know yourself? What contributed to your understanding of yourself and your needs? And how does this benefit your life and outcomes? So if we think, as adults, what helped you to understand who you are and what your needs are and where these needs came from? And if we think about children and thinking about their identities, as adults, our life experiences, the people we connect with, whether we've had our own therapy and coaching, or we have all these contributors that really help us to develop a deeper understanding of who we are. For children, they don't know who they are yet. But what they do want to know is, why am I different to my friends? Why don't some of these things make sense to me? Why do I react differently to other people? Why don't other people find these things really easy? Why do I find some things really hard? And why do different things matter to me? And I've had lots of really phenomenal conversations with the young people that I work with the last few weeks. And so many of them are like, well, if everyone just behaved the way that I did and followed the rules, then everything would be so much easier. My autistic children are like, I just don't get why people just don't follow the rules, because I really like rules. Whereas on the reverse of it, some of my ADHD young people have said to me, why do people find some of this stuff really hard? I can just do maths with my eyes shut because I can just see the solutions. But then they're getting into trouble at school because they're not putting the workings out on the paper, but they've got the answer correct because they can just see the answers. And, we have these phenomenal skills that come with neurodivergence that actually sometimes my phenomenal superpowers still create a barrier because I'm not understanding why other people find this stuff so easy. Whereas the verse of it, some of my teenagers are saying to me, why am I finding it so hard to understand my friends? Why is it that if I'm watching my friend who's really upset, I really struggle to meet their needs because I just don't understand what they're so upset about, because that wouldn't bother me. And one of my real interest points is around, the emotional literacy levels that come so often with neurodivergence and the social gaps that this creates. And obviously we started putting into schools things like ELSA programs, but for your children with more complex needs or with neurodevelopmental needs, sometimes that doesn't meet their needs on the same level as a child who just needs some level of input. So we've got in the comment box, those who do well push through barriers and hurdles and defy ego, stigma, judgment for what's best for the child. You just need adults to stand up for them before they can. I have also seen those with ADHD to label themselves, I have ADHD and I can't. I think subconsciously they defeat the battle before it begins, feeling that they have been dealt with such a card in life and nothing can be done. And we've got emotional literacy is crucial. It's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the big things I see in my work is young people with ADHD have often got such a high level of emotional rejection sensitivity that actually, if they ask for help the first time and it didn't happen, they lose trust in all adults very, very quickly. And if we think about 80% of children, it's hereditary, 80% of those traits, then actually if I have a parent who also has high levels of rejection sensitivity and they are told no, then that can start passing down. So we can see, these really limiting beliefs that happen. And then the magic that happens when we start meeting someone really awesome who says, you know, actually, you've got all these other skills and I'm going to coach you to help you understand it. So when we're starting to think about helping children, we're thinking about actually giving them a diagnosis, putting them in a box, isn't about limiting them, but it's helping them to understand their own identities, helping them understand their feelings, behaviors, and responses, being able to learn how to better meet their own needs, being able to recognize their boundaries, and being able to communicate their needs to those around them. Whereas on the reverse of it, within their world, a diagnosis can mean that we've got appropriate accommodations in education, employment, and health, support from services, and family and friends being better able to support. There is, and I think there was an interesting point earlier on, is around that we sometimes get a diagnosis and it's missed. And what happens predominantly with females is they will get a diagnosis of anxiety very early on in their lives. And what we see happen is what we call diagnostic overshadowing, that once I've got a diagnosis of anxiety, every single symptom I have is attributed to that anxiety. So we almost have this assumption clause that begins, and this assumption bias that, you know, oh, it's just their anxiety. And we stop asking questions. And I truly think it's why so many coaches and therapists pick up the gaps, because they get to know the young people. Often for men too, they bottle stuff up, stiff upper lip, totally in. And it is, you know, we see a lot that young people have just been given a label. I've got lots of boys at the moment that have just been labeled as difficult. They're just challenging, they're not engaged, and nobody's asking those questions of what else is going on around us right now. So do we have any questions? I think anybody wants to ask? One there. Oh. How does one approach a school for diagnosis to start? So if we're thinking about asking them for starting an assessment, the schools can start that process. There is some, I think, I don't want to use the word shifting, but there's some, you know, oh, you've got to do it through your GP. A school is more than able to start the diagnosis process. So a parent would need to organise a meeting with the SENCO at the school, and the SENCO would then ideally meet with the parents, review their needs. What I always advise with parents, or we do it in coaching together, is we write a list of the actual challenges with examples. What can often happen is we walk into a room and we say, oh, I think my child's got autism. I think my child's got ADHD. And they'll say, why? And the parent will give one or two examples, and there's not enough evidence for the school to see it. And because we know that a lot of children are master maskers, they go into school, and what the school sees versus the parent can be very, very different. That what we actually want to do is provide them with as much evidence as possible. So if you're working with families and you're coaching them, it's really beneficial to sit with the parent and the child and to actually think about what are the challenges that I'm experiencing, and could give a couple of examples of them. So if we're saying, you know, my child becomes really emotionally dysregulated, when and why? So if we're thinking, you know, if we're doing this and saying, I don't know, my child becomes really emotionally dysregulated, this is made worse when there's sudden changes, when we're going to new places, when something hasn't happened as expected, and we're given these examples, and then give a deeper example that we can take with it. Because when you just think, you know, and I do get it, when I used to teach, I had 500 students in my year group, and I did know a lot of them really well, but there were some that I didn't know so well because I saw them less. The school will only have a snapshot of what's going on with this child, and the schools often focus most on the children that obviously are most vocal or have the highest amount of needs. And sometimes our autism children and our ADHD children can actually sometimes drift into the background. They can sometimes be the quietest children in the class because they've just shut down, they've disconnected, they've dissociated. So sometimes we actually need to paint the picture. So do really make some very clear observations, create as much detail as possible. Ideally, type it up so the school have got a copy. So when they're actually completing and compiling their data, they've got that. I'm curious, is it more often that the parents or the teachers who notice the need for diagnosis to start? Do you know, it's interesting because it is a bit of a mix. Sometimes the schools will. I think it depends on how astute the teachers are, the relationship the teachers have. I think some parents, and this is perhaps a challenge that happens, I've got a mix of some parents who kind of know something's happening, not quite sure what it is, but just are aware that their child is struggling perhaps more than they like are aware. I very often find the child is the one who knows first. And the children will come into your office or your coaching area, wherever you are, and they have started doing things that manage their symptoms without realizing what they're doing. Almost like this child has this intuitive understanding that something is going on. And they very often have tried to verbalize this at some point, but because they didn't, I suppose, have the stereotypical symptoms that we're looking for, it can sometimes get pushed away. Parents, I think, intuitively do adapt to the children's needs, without even realizing again what they're doing. But like children, I've seen them, something you can really do for children who are regulating is recognize that they need to decompress and helping them decompress. And because with ADHD their dopamine levels are too low, what I find is actually children are very, very good at finding ways to do it. So a lot of my kids will come home and fill themselves up with carbohydrates. If they can't find those, I had a whole host of kids during lockdown eating dried pasta because dried pasta is full of dopamine. So they were crunching away on dried pasta, activating their vagal nerve, which was regulating them, and giving themselves a dopamine hit all at the same time. So parents, they were like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Well, it's almost phenomenal, isn't it? They're getting the dopamine hit because pasta is full of dopamine. They're getting the crunch, which there is activating their vagal nerve, which therefore is regulating them. And therefore they feel better. So they've realized what they're doing." So I think very often for me, it was the children who know that something's going on. There's obviously a lot of backlash around things like TikTok, but for a lot of children, actually, TikTok has become a phenomenal platform for educating people. And, they're saying at the moment that TikTok has led to a rise of 20 to 30% of assessments and diagnoses happening. I'm like, all it's really done is raised the conversation and made more people aware, and people are going, "Oh my God, that's me." So I've had lots of adults sitting in the office going, "Oh my God, I didn't realize that was me." And we've got in the comments, my daughter's autistic. I didn't know until she was 21. I've got a couple at the moment, 20, 21 upwards, that we're having diagnosed. And, because they're so high functioning, and a lot of them extremely high IQs, that it wasn't noticeable. But actually what was noticeable is some of the social needs, some of the emotional needs, finding some of those things difficult. Children can act differently at home and school, at least mine do. And it is a challenge, isn't it? I think, we have our school persona and we have our home persona. What we find is with children who have been at school all day, if I'm masking all day, I come home and decompress all over my parents. So my parents see the reality, but even then, they don't always see everything. They see what the child is able to share. And so we can have these gaps that occur. I've been a teacher for 20 years in the secondary sector. Our frustration as teachers and pastoral leaders was the perception that a diagnosis was act as a magic wand. In reality, it makes little difference and funding is minimal. Does not provide TA support, for example. The staff remain untrained. Schools try to utilise strategies appropriate for neurodivergence where they believe they may be of need with or without a diagnosis. Well, the real issue here is a lack of training for teachers in realistic strategies, a system that's not appropriate for many children, lack of time to dedicate to unpicking and understanding individual children. To add, for a school of 1,500 teenagers, our trust only made provision for 12 hours of educational psych time. And it is a real challenge because I think where to change the whole picture, we need to revolutionize the curriculum that we give to newly trained teachers, because I feel like they're almost put in the lion's den because they're not given that equipment to deal with it. The funding obviously is really amiss, and the same's happened in the early years sector. Like the funding for free education hasn't risen in line with inflation. So childminders are closing down their settings, who very often did pick some of these things up, but can't provide the same level of care anymore because the funding has dropped so much. It's just not financially viable for them. We're seeing the same in the education sector. And I think all we can do is empower parents to have a better understanding, to also meet their children's needs at home. And there are sometimes, people that are like a diagnosis is a quick and easy option. But we need to start somewhere. And for children to actually have a chance, we first need for them to have that opportunity to be considering, where my needs sit within this. As well as the curriculum for NQT, we need to reconsider the national curriculum. Oh, Ian, yes, we do. It was really hard, generally writing the senior mental health lead training for schools. I just felt like they were going to get to the end of it and realize that, this is just a massive battle and it's very hard to change this. I do believe we can make a difference. But some things we need to think about is, you know, sometimes just our own personal beliefs. You know, what do we need to challenge in ourselves to further enhance the support that we provide for children and young people? I did a postgrad diploma in psychology and neuroscience of mental health, and my favorite aspect of that was the deep dive we did into autism and ADHD and the neuroscience of how their brains work. And, you know, it was pivotal in the work that I was able to do with families, but I'm still unpicking it. And I think a lot of what we see is a lot of training around the signs and symptoms, but not around the strategies that work. What steps do you need to take in order to enhance your understanding of diagnosis pathways? And especially in your local authority areas, if you're working with local authorities, just being aware of, you know, the differences that they can incur with them. And think about who can help you, not how, who. Who do you need to get around to help you develop your understanding so that we can start making a bigger difference? Because very often our coaches can do some phenomenal things. I also find as they get into college and university, we see very different levels of support. So for example, Lincoln University are currently offering that anyone who's got a diagnosis can go and spend, I think it's either 3 or 5 days at the university in the summer holidays before they start. They choose their room. They can meet people who they choose to live with. They can start considering, you know, they can meet all their tutors and have some one-to-one time with their tutors. So that transition to university just becomes so much better. And some of the universities are offering some phenomenal support. So whilst we've got the limitations in the core education system, there's actually some great stuff happening in higher education to support that. If anybody wants to do a little bit more learning, there is a free course on my site called 10 Things You Need to Know About ADHD, which you are more than welcome to have a scan and go and have an explore of. Please do help yourselves if you want to just understand a little bit more about ADHD. I can't teach you all in 10 minutes, but it's there for you if you need it. And I will also pop in the chat box a Dropbox link. I'm going to attempt to do this with some notes on it for people who would like to have a look at that. Let's work out how do I paste when I've got it pasted elsewhere? Oh my goodness me. I was doing so well with the tech up until then, wasn't I?
That's nothing compared to the tech I haven't been doing so well today. Nikki, if you could email me all the details, I'll pass them out.
Lovely. I'll tell
Right?
you what, if I close this down, I can pop
Because,
in the group for you
yeah,
quickly.
because there are people who will want to
Okay.
listen to this who aren't here today, and they won't see the chat box.
Yeah, not a problem. I will email it over to you, Ian. That's fine. There we go. There's a Dropbox link with some downloads in there for anybody who wants just some brief notes and some of the images from the slides. But yes, thank you very much for having me, Ian.
Nikki, thank you so much indeed for all of that. I know you tackled it at speed, and I hope some of our congregation today who maybe not uh, full English speakers can keep up, but at least I'll have the I hope anyway, if it all works, the recording to go back on.
Fingers crossed.
So
It's interesting actually
thank
with the comment there about the home ed community. And oh, honestly, I feel like the home ed community is just full of parents who didn't get what they needed. And I think there's so much help. And actually, some of my coaches are very much going into the home ed communities and offering some phenomenal support right now. It is so, so needed. Isn't it, Brian? Yes, it is.
So what do you think about the home ed community then, Helen?
So I've got 3 boys, and I'm extremely lucky. They're all doing really, really well. I think you sometimes do have this stigma around you that, oh, your children are home ed, therefore they must have additional needs, and that's the reason that you took them out of mainstream education. That's not the case for us, but it's constant over our social groups or chat. So many families have taken their children out of mainstream because they feel that their child's needs aren't being met. And I've had school perspectives and parents' perspectives, and there's a lot of conflicts there, I feel. And everyone, well, in the home ed, there doesn't seem to be the resources. And if they've not got the funds to privately educate themselves or get help, they just seem to be a bit lost, in all fairness.
So something that might be of help, Helen, is something we've seen down here in Sussex. I don't know obviously where you're based, but one of my girls, she's actually set up a coaching provision for children and families on a farm. And she's had quite a lot of families come to her that there is a diagnosis in place and they're being homeschooled, and through the local authority, they've been able to get support for emotional literacy guidance. So because as part of her course that she did with me, we cover emotional literacy in quite a lot of depth and coaching around emotional literacy. You can't get support for mental health coaching, but you can get support for emotional literacy input for children. So if you can find a coach who covers emotional literacy in depth, and you've got the same arrangements with your local authority, if they've got a diagnosis, they can actually access funding. So she's been able to provide funded support for children who have a diagnosis through the local authority, but it's just not mental health based, it's emotional literacy based.
It's a minefield, isn't it? And when you don't know this information, I mean, as well, you know, home ed communities are fairly unregulated, which I personally don't fully agree with. I think there should be some more things put in place. But I hand on heart, actually, I don't know whether I would pick up on any additional needs that my children would have. I'd like to think I would, but I'm honestly not sure. And I think I'm quite a bright person, so I just think if you are doing your best at home, providing education, choosing to home ed, we're not in a position where we would probably actually pick up on our child's needs, and no one else would actually be looking at them.
Yeah, and I think it is, you know, I work with quite a few local charities where we are in Sussex, and have quite a lot of parents that are home ed based parents, and you do need that second pair of eyes. You just need someone to ask a different set of questions. And, you know, when you're around it all the time, it's just your normal. And parents are so intuitively able to adapt to children's needs that therefore, actually, why would I notice that there was something fundamentally they were finding very challenging? Because as a parent, I just kind of swoop in and change the way I'm dealing with things to make it easier for them. So I think, you know, that second pair of eyes and ears can sometimes be so invaluable to families, just to go, actually, you know, what about trying this? So it is really hard, because I think, you know, Brian's have got a few needs, haven't you, Brian? And you do just adapt to them. It's just, you know, that's what we do as human beings. And especially when you love your children, why wouldn't you? Fabs.
Thank you.
Just to finish up, because I know we're just running over time, there is, I came across an acronym the other day that somebody tried to explain to me, education otherwise than at school, EOTAS, and that can lead to funding as well, but you have to make your case.
There is some great stuff out there. It's just, I don't know, it's conversations like today that you go, oh, I wouldn't have thought about that. So, but definitely do have a look if there's some emotional literacy support for your local authority, because it's kind of hidden. I guess if they said mental health support, everyone would be claiming it. So if they call it emotional literacy support, it's got a different concept behind it, but it's pretty good funding as well. Like, it's been quite adequate to provide quite a depth. So one of my coaches is providing 6 hours of funding a week. So it's quite a lot of input for a parent who actually having that second person could be quite handy. Yay. Fab. Thank you very much.